Part 1. Hook. First 1 to 2 minutes. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, a large commercial airliner lifted off from the runway of Kuala Lumpur International Airport. On board were 239 people, passengers, pilots, and crew, beginning what should have been a routine overnight flight. The aircraft was a modern, highly advanced jet, a Boeing 777, one of the safest and most reliable airplanes ever built. Its destination was Beijing. The flight number was Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Everything about the journey seemed normal. The weather was calm, the aircraft had passed all safety checks, the pilots were experienced professionals, the passengers were settling into their seats, some preparing to sleep through the night, while others watched movies or looked out into the darkness beyond the cabin windows. At 12:41 a.m., the aircraft began its climb into the night sky. For nearly 40 minutes, the flight proceeded exactly as expected. The air traffic controllers monitored the aircraft on radar as it followed its assigned route over the warm waters of South China Sea. Then, something unusual happened. At 1:19 a.m., the captain responded to a routine radio instruction from air traffic control. His final words were calm and ordinary. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was the kind of message that pilots transmit thousands of times every day. No distress, no warning, no hint that anything was wrong. Just a normal goodbye. Moments later, the aircraft disappeared from civilian radar. Not gradually, not slowly. Instantly. Within seconds, the signal from Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 simply vanished from the screens of controllers who had been watching it moments before. At first, no one panicked. Radar contact is occasionally lost for short periods during routine flights, especially when aircraft move between different air traffic control zones. Controllers assumed the plane would soon appear again on another radar system. But minutes passed, then more minutes, and then the aircraft did not reappear. Air traffic controllers attempted to contact the cockpit. There was no response. Meanwhile, families of passengers sleeping in cities around the world had no idea that something unusual had happened. For them, it was just still another quiet night. But inside air traffic control centers, confusion was beginning to grow. How could a massive aircraft carrying 239 people simply disappear? Modern commercial airplanes are equipped with multiple communication systems, tracking devices, and emergency beacons. Even if something went wrong, there should have been some signal, some clue, something to explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No distress call, no emergency message, no sign of trouble, just silence. And the more time passed, the stranger the situation became. Because the mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was only beginning. In the hours and days that followed, search teams would launch one of the largest and most expensive aviation investigations in history. Governments, satellites, military radar systems, and thousands of experts would work together trying to answer one haunting question. Where had the plane gone? How could a massive aircraft simply vanish in the modern world, an age of satellites, radar, and global communication? And perhaps the most unsettling questions of all, what really happened in the dark sky above the South China Sea that night? More than a decade later, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains one of the greatest aviation mysteries of the 20th century. And the story behind it is far stranger than anyone first imagined. Part 2. Historical background. To understand the mystery surrounding Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, we must first look at the time and circumstances in which this event occurred. The year was 2014. Commercial aviation had reached an extraordinary level of technological advancement. Modern aircraft were equipped with sophisticated navigation systems, satellite communication, and multiple layers of safety protocols. Air travel had become one of the safest forms of transportation in the world. Aircraft like Boeing 777 were considered engineering masterpieces. Since its introduction in the 1990s, the Boeing 777 had earned a reputation for reliability and safety. Millions of passengers traveled on this aircraft type every year, crossing oceans and continents without incident. By 2014, global aviation networks connected nearly every major city on Earth. Flights moved constantly across the skies above Asia, Europe, and Americas. Air traffic control systems monitored these aircraft using radar and satellite technology, making it extremely rare for a modern airliner to completely disappear. The flight at the center of this mystery belonged to Malaysia Airlines, the national airline of Malaysia. The airline had operated for decades and was widely respected throughout the aviation industry. Its pilots were well trained, and its aircraft were maintained according to strict international standards. On the night of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was scheduled to travel from Kuala Lumpur International Airport to Beijing. The route between these two cities was one of the busiest international corridors in Asia, used by dozens of flights every day. On board was the aircraft were 239 people. Most of the passengers were citizens of China, many of them traveling home after vacations or business trips in Southeast Asia. Others came from several different countries, including Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia, and the United States. Among the passengers were families, professionals, students, and travelers returning home. Some were sleeping during the overnight flight. Others was likely watching movies or listening to music as the aircraft crossed the dark waters of the South China Sea. At the controls of the aircraft were two experienced pilots. The captain was Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old veteran pilot with more than 18,000 hours of flight experience. He had worked for Malaysia Airlines for many years and was considered highly skilled. Outside of his professional life, Zahari was known to have a strong interest in aviation technology and even maintained a home flight simulator. The first officer was Farid Abdul Hamid, a 27-year-old co-pilot who was building his career as a commercial aviator. Although younger than the captain, he had already accumulated thousands of flight hours and was considered a capable pilot. Together, the two pilots were responsible for guiding the aircraft safely across nearly 4,400 kilometers of airspace. The aircraft itself had been operating normally before departure. Maintenance records showed no major mechanical problems. The weather forecast for the route was relatively calm, with no severe storms expected along the flight path. Everything about the journey suggested it would be an ordinary overnight flight. The aircraft departed shortly after midnight from Kuala Lumpur International Airport and climbed into the night sky, heading northeast toward Beijing. For the first part of the flight, the aircraft followed its planned route over the South China Sea, passing through the airspace monitored by Malaysian air traffic controllers. Soon, the aircraft would approach the boundary where responsibility for monitoring the flight would transfer from Malaysian controllers to Vietnamese air traffic control. This type of handoff happens thousands of times every day across international airspace. Normally, it is routine and uneventful. But on this particular night, something went terribly wrong during that transition. Within minutes of the handoff, the aircraft would disappear from civilian radar. And what began as a routine flight between Kuala Lumpur and Beijing would soon become the greatest aviation mystery of the 21st century. Part 3. The story begins. The night of March 7th, 2014 was quiet at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Travelers moved through the brightly lit terminal, checking their bags, boarding flights, and preparing for overnight journeys across Asia. Among the many aircraft preparing for departure that evening was Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The aircraft assigned to the flight was a Boeing 777, one of the most advanced and trusted passenger jets in the world. It had completed thousands of flights without major incident and was considered extremely reliable. Passengers began boarding shortly after midnight. Inside the cabin, people settled into their seats. Some passengers placed bags into overhead compartments, while others looked out the window at the lights of the airport runway. Many travelers on overnight flights tried to sleep early, hoping to arrive at their destination rested. On board were 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The aircraft's destination was Beijing, a journey of roughly 6 hours from Kuala Lumpur. The flight path would take the aircraft northeast across the South China Sea before entering Vietnamese airspace, continuing towards northern China. In the cockpit, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farid Abdul Hamid completed their final pre-flight checks. Every instrument was examined carefully. Navigation systems, fuel levels, communication equipment, and weather data were all reviewed before departure. These procedures were routine for commercial pilots and were designed to ensure the aircraft was ready for a safe journey. Everything appeared normal. At 12:41 a.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Moments later, a massive jet lifted smoothly into the night sky, leaving the runway of Kuala Lumpur International Airport and climbing toward cruising altitude. Air traffic controllers watched the aircraft on their radar screens as it followed its assigned route. For the first several minutes, the flight proceeded exactly as planned. The aircraft climbed to approximately 35,000 feet, settling into its cruise altitude above the dark waters of South China Sea. Inside the cabin, the crew likely began their normal routine. Cabin lights would have been dimmed for the overnight journey, and flight attendants may have started preparing refreshments for passengers who were still awake. Everything about the flight appeared ordinary. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued along a navigation route marked by a series of invisible waypoints in the sky. One of these waypoints was called Hijacking. Located over the South China Sea, this point marked the boundary between the airspace controlled by Malaysia and the airspace controlled by Vietnam. When aircraft reach this point, air traffic control responsibility is transferred from one country to another. As the aircraft approached Hijacking, Malaysian controllers prepared to hand the flight over to Vietnamese air traffic control. At 1:19 a.m., the final radio communication from the cockpit was transmitted. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah calmly responded to the controller's instructions. His message was simple and routine. "Good night. Malaysian 370. It was the last confirmed communication from the aircraft. Less than 2 minutes later, something unexpected happened. The aircraft's secondary radar signal, which provides identification and altitude information to air traffic control, suddenly disappeared. On the radar screen in the control center, the symbol representing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 simply vanished. At first, this did not immediately cause alarm. Occasionally, aircraft temporarily lose transponder signals due to technical issues. Controllers assumed the signal might return shortly, but the signal never came back. Attempts to contact the cockpit by radio was unsuccessful. Meanwhile, the aircraft should have appeared on Vietnamese radar systems as it entered their airspace, but it didn't. From the perspective of civilian air traffic control, the aircraft had simply disappeared somewhere above the South China Sea. What the controllers did not yet realize was that military radar systems would later reveal something even more puzzling. According to later analysis, after the aircraft vanished from the civilian radio, it may have changed direction. Instead of continuing towards Beijing, the aircraft appeared to turn back towards the west. If that information was correct, it meant that the plane had reversed course and flown back across the Malay Peninsula, far away from its original route. But why? What could have caused a large passenger jet to suddenly change direction in the middle of the night without sending any distress signal? At that moment, no one yet understood that the flight's strange behavior was only the beginning of a mystery that would soon puzzle investigators around the world. And the most shocking discoveries about Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 were still to come. Part 4. The Mysterious Event. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, something deeply puzzling occurred in the sky above Southeast Asia. What had begun as a routine overnight journey from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing suddenly turned into one of the most baffling aviation mysteries in the modern history. The aircraft, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, had been cruising normally over the dark waters of South China Sea. Air traffic controllers had just received the final radio message from the cockpit. The voice of Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had calmly said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was a routine farewell as the aircraft prepared to leave Malaysian airspace. But within minutes of that message, something strange happened. At 1:21 a.m., the aircraft's transponder, the device that sends identification and altitude information to civilian radar systems, suddenly stopped transmitting. On the radar screens inside Malaysian air traffic control centers, the aircraft later simply disappeared. To the controllers watching their monitors, the plane had suddenly become invisible. Normally, even if a transponder fails, the aircraft itself can still be tracked using primary radar, which detects objects in the sky without relying on onboard signals. But primary radar provides less information and is typically used by military systems rather than civilian controllers. At first, no one suspected anything unusual. Controllers believed the aircraft would soon appear on the radar screens operated by Vietnamese air traffic control as it crossed the boundary near the waypoint known as Iguri over the South China Sea. But the aircraft would never appeared. Vietnamese controllers waited. Minutes passed. Nothing, still nothing. Repeated attempts were made to contact the aircraft by radio. There was no reply. As the minutes turned into an hour, confusion began to spread among aviation authorities. Where had the aircraft gone? The answer would not begin to emerge until later, when investigators reviewed military radar records. those radar systems revealed something shocking. After the transponder signal vanished, the aircraft appeared to make a sharp turn to the west. Instead of continuing toward Beijing, the aircraft seemed to reverse course and fly back across the Malay Peninsula. According to radar data, the plane passed near the northern region of Malaysia and then continued out toward the Andaman Sea. This unexpected maneuver raised immediate questions. Why would a commercial airliner suddenly change direction without notifying air traffic control? Even more puzzling was the fact that no distress signal had been transmitted. Modern aircraft are equipped with multiple communication systems designed to alert controllers in emergencies. If a mechanical failure or crisis had occurred, pilots would normally send a radio message or activate emergency codes on the transponder. But in this case, there had been complete silence. Later analysis suggested that several communication systems on board the aircraft had been turned off or stopped transmitting. One of these systems was ACARS, ACARS, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, which automatically sends maintenance and performance data from the aircraft to airline operation centers. Shortly before the transponder disappeared, ACARS had also stopped sending data. This raised a disturbing possibility. Had the communication systems been intentionally disabled? As investigators studied the radar tracks, they discovered that the aircraft continued flying westward for several hours after disappearing from civilian radar. But that was not the only clue. Satellites operated by the company Inmarsat had recorded a series of faint signals, known as handshakes, between the aircraft and a communication satellite. These signals were not full transmissions, but automatic electronic responses that occurred approximately once every hour. Although the aircraft was no longer sending normal messages, the satellite system could still detect these pings. The data suggested something remarkable. Instead of crashing shortly after disappearing, the aircraft had continued flying for several more hours. Experts analyzed the timing of the satellite signals and used them to estimate possible flight paths. Two large arcs across the globe were calculated, one stretching north toward Central Asia and another extending south across the vast Indian Ocean. But without additional radar or communication data, investigators could not determine which direction the aircraft was taking. Meanwhile, families of passengers gathered in airports across Asia, desperately waiting for information. At Beijing Capital International Airport, relatives waited anxiously for a flight that would never arrive. News of the missing aircraft quickly spread around the world. Governments, aviation authorities, and search teams began preparing for what could become one of the largest search operations in aviation history. Yet, even as investigators worked to piece together the aircraft's final movements, one unsettling fact remained clear. Somewhere in the darkness of that night, a massive Boeing 777 carrying 239 people had vanished. No distress call, no confirmed crash site, just a series of puzzling signals and radar traces. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the mystery became. Because of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was not just an aviation accident. It was a mystery that would challenge scientists, investigators, and governments for years to come. Part 5. Investigation. When it became clear that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had disappeared, aviation authorities across the world launched an investigation unlike anything seen before. A modern airliner carrying 239 people had vanished, and no one knew where it had gone. In the first hours after the aircraft failed to arrive in Beijing, officials believed the plane might have crashed somewhere in the South China Sea. Because the aircraft had last been seen on radar in that region, early search efforts focused on the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam. Ships and aircraft from several countries began scanning the ocean for signs of wreckage. Helicopters flew low over the water looking for floating debris. Naval vessels moved slowly through the waves searching for oil slicks or life rafts. Governments across Asia joined the effort, including China, Vietnam, and the United States. But after days of searching, no confirmed debris were found. Then investigators discovered something that completely changed the direction of the investigation. Military radar data from Malaysia revealed that after disappearing from civilian data, the aircraft appeared to turn sharply and fly back across the Malay Peninsula. Instead of continuing toward Beijing, it had traveled west toward the Andaman Sea. This revelation shocked investigators. It meant the aircraft had remained in the air long after its last communication with air traffic control. The search area suddenly expanded dramatically. Attention shifted from the South China Sea to a much larger region stretching into the Indian Ocean. At this point, investigators turned to satellite technology for help. Engineers working with satellite company Inmarsat analyzed a series of faint electronic signals that had been automatically exchanged between the aircraft and a communication satellite. These signals, often referred to as satellite handshakes, occurred rapidly once every hour after the aircraft's communication system had stopped transmitting normal messages. Although the signals did not reveal the aircraft's exact location, they allowed experts to calculate the distance between the plane and the satellite at different moments in time. By studying these distances, investigators created two possible flight paths. One path stretched north across Asia towards regions such as Central Asia. The other curved south across the vast, remote waters of the Indian Ocean. Further analysis of satellite data suggested that the southern route was far more likely. If this conclusion were correct, it meant the aircraft had continued flying for several hours before eventually running out of fuel somewhere in one of the most remote parts of the ocean on Earth. This discovery led to one of the largest and most expensive search operations in aviation history. Multiple countries joined the effort, including Australia, which eventually took a leading role in the search. Aircraft flew along missions across the southern Indian Ocean, scanning the water for debris. Ships equipped with advanced sonar systems searched the ocean floor thousands of meters below the surface. The region being searched was enormous and extremely difficult to explore. The southern Indian Ocean is known for its powerful winds, massive waves, and deep underwater terrain. Some areas of the seabed lie more than 6,000 meters below the surface. Despite these challenges, search teams spent years examining the ocean floor using underwater drones and sophisticated mapping equipment. Investigators also examined the personal backgrounds of the passengers and crew aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Particular attention was given to the pilot, Zahari Ahmad Shah, and the co-pilot, Farid Abdul Hamid. Authorities searched their homes, reviewed flight records, and analyzed computer data, including files found on the captain's personal flight simulator. Investigators tried to determine whether the aircraft's unusual movements might have been intentional. However, no clear evidence emerged proving that either pilots had deliberately caused the aircraft to disappear. Meanwhile, search teams began to find a few pieces of debris years later on distant shores. One of the most important discoveries occurred in 2015 on the island of Reunion. A large piece of aircraft wing known as a flaperon washed ashore. Aviation experts later confirmed that the part belonged to a Boeing 777 and was almost certainly from Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Additional fragments believed to be from the aircraft were later discovered along the coastline of Mozambique, Tanzania, and South Africa. These discoveries confirmed one tragic reality. The aircraft had likely to crash somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. But despite years of searching and millions of square kilometers of ocean being examined, the main wreckage of the aircraft has never been found. Without the aircraft flight recorders, often called the black boxes, investigators have been unable to determine exactly what happened during the flight's final hours. And so, despite the largest search effort in aviation history, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the modern world. Part 6. Theories and Explanations. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains one of the most puzzling aviation mysteries in the modern history. Despite years of investigation and massive search operations across the Indian Ocean, investigators have never found the main wreckage of the aircraft. Without the flight recorders, many questions remain unanswered. Because of this lack of definitive evidence, several theories have emerged attempting to explain what might have happened during the aircraft's final hours. Some theories are based on technical analysis and aviation science, while others are more speculative. Each theory has supporters who believe it offers the most logical explanation for its mysterious disappearance. One of the most widely discussed explanations is the pilot involvement theory. According to this theory, the captain of the aircraft, Zahari Ahmad Shah, may have intentionally diverted the plane from its original route. Supporters of this theory point to the unusual flight path detected by military radar. After the aircraft lost contact with air traffic control, it appeared to turn sharply and fly back across the Malaysian peninsula, before heading toward the southern Indian Ocean. This maneuver suggested that someone with detailed knowledge of aviation systems might have been controlling the aircraft. Turning off the transponder and other communication systems also required a certain level of technical understanding. Investigators also discovered that the captain had a sophisticated home flight simulator. Some reports claim that investigators found simulated flight routes on the device that appeared to travel toward remote regions of the southern Indian Ocean. Supporters of this theory believe the captain would have intentionally flown the aircraft to a remote area where it would eventually run out of fuel and crash into the ocean, making wreckage extremely difficult to locate. However, there is no definitive proof that this happened. Friends and colleagues described the captain as an experienced and respected pilot with no clear motive for such an action. Because of this, many investigators remain cautious about fully accepting this explanation. Another commonly discussed possibility is the hijacking theory. In this scenario, someone aboard the aircraft may have taken control of the plane. This could have been a passenger or possibly someone with access to the cockpit. Those who support this theory argue that the aircraft's sudden change in direction and the shutdown of communication systems would suggest deliberate interference. Hijackers might have forced the pilots to change course or even taken control themselves. However, Investigations into the passengers aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 did not uncover strong evidence linking anyone to a planned hijacking. Security checks were reviewed, and intelligence agencies examined possible connection to extremist groups. No credible link was ever discovered. Because of the lack of evidence, many experts believe a hijacking is less likely than other explanations. A third theory suggests that a catastrophic onboard fire or technical emergency may have disabled the crew. Some aviation specialists believe that a fire could have started in the aircraft's electronics compartment or cargo hold. If smoke filled the cockpit, the pilot may have attempted to turn the aircraft back toward the nearest airport while dealing with the emergency. During such a crisis, the crew might have become incapacitated due to smoke inhalation or lack of oxygen. If the aircraft then continued flying on autopilot, it could have gradually traveled south until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. Supporters of this theory note that aviation accidents involving onboard fires have occurred in the past, sometimes disabling aircraft systems and crews before emergency messages could be transmitted. This explanation also fits with the satellite data, suggesting the plane continued flying for several hours after its final communication. Another theory is known as the hypoxia scenario. Hypoxia occurs when oxygen levels inside an aircraft cabin drop to dangerously low levels. This can happen if there is a sudden loss of cabin pressurization. In such situations, pilots are trained to descend rapidly to a lower altitude where passengers and crew can breathe normally. However, if the pilots fail to react quickly enough, both the crew and passengers would gradually lose consciousness. In this scenario, the aircraft could continue flying on autopilot while everyone on board was incapacitated. Eventually, the plane would run out of fuel and crash somewhere far from its original route. Supporters of this theory often compare it to another aviation incident involving Helios Airways Flight 522, in which a loss of cabin pressurization caused everyone on board to lose consciousness while the aircraft continued flying on autopilot. Because the aircraft eventually crashed after running out of fuel, some experts believe a similar situation could have occurred with Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. There are also more controversial theories. Some people believed the aircraft may have been accidentally shot down during a military exercise. Others have suggested secret intelligence operations or classified military technology might somehow be involved. However, investigators have found no reliable evidence supporting these claims. Still, because the main wreckage of the aircraft has never been located, speculation continues. The lack of clear answers allows different theories to persist, each attempting to explain the strange sequence of events that unfolded on that night in March 2014. Even after years of investigation, the exact reason why Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared remains unknown. And until the aircraft itself is found, the truth behind the greatest aviation mystery of the 21st century may remain hidden somewhere beneath the vast water of Indian Ocean. Part 7. The Unanswered Questions. Even after years of investigation, international search missions, and the analysis of countless technical reports, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 continued to leave behind a long list of unanswered questions. These mysteries are the reason why this case is still considered the greatest aviation mystery of the 21st century. One of the biggest unanswered questions is the simple but profound. What exactly happened inside the aircraft during its final hours? Investigators know that the plane departed from Kuala Lumpur and was scheduled to land in Beijing. They also know that its transponder stopped transmitting shortly after the aircraft entered Vietnamese airspace. Military radar later detected the plane turning back across the Malay Peninsula and heading toward the Andaman Sea. But what caused this dramatic change of course? No distress call was ever sent. Modern commercial aircraft are equipped with multiple communication systems designed to alert air traffic control during emergencies. Yet, the crew of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 never transmitted a message indicating mechanical problems, hijacking, or any other crisis. This silence remains one of the most puzzling elements of the entire case. Another unanswered question involved who or what was controlling the aircraft after it disappeared from the civilian radar. Satellite data later showed that the plane continued flying for several hours. This suggests that the aircraft remained operational long after its communication system stopped working. But was the plane being actively controlled by someone in the cockpit? Or was it simply flying on autopilot while everyone on board was incapacitated? Without the aircraft flight recorders, it is impossible to know what actions were taken inside the cockpit during that time. Another mystery concerns the role of the pilots themselves, particularly the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah. Investigators carefully examined his personal life, professional history, and even files recovered from his home flight simulator. Some reports suggested that simulated route on the device resembled the aircraft's possible path into the southern Indian Ocean. But the evidence was never strong enough to confirm deliberate involvement. Friends and colleagues described him as an experienced and respected pilot with thousands of flight hours. No clear motive was ever identified that could explain why he would intentionally divert the aircraft. This leaves a troubling question. Was the course change intentional, or was it the result of an emergency situation? Another mystery is the exact location of the aircraft's crash site. Although satellite analysis suggested that the plane likely to ended its journey somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, the search areas cover an enormous and extremely remote region. Ocean currents later carried pieces of debris across thousands of kilometers. Some confirmed fragments washed ashore on islands such as Reunion and along the coast of East Africa. These discoveries proved that the aircraft ended up in the ocean, but they did not reveal the precise location of the main wreckage. And without the wreckage, investigators cannot recover the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the devices that could finally explain the aircraft's last moments. Another unanswered question involves the final descent of the aircraft. Did the plane glide slowly into the ocean under controlled conditions, or did it plunge into the water at high speed after running out of fuel? Different interpretations of satellite data have produced different possibilities. Some experts believe the aircraft may have been descending rapidly in its final minutes, while others suggest a more gradual descent. This detail matters because it could indicate whether someone was still conscious and controlling the plane at the end. Perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: why did no one on board manage to communicate what was happening? In an age where aircraft are equipped with advanced communication systems and passengers carry mobile devices, the total absence of messages or signals from the aircraft remains deeply mysterious. For families of the 239 people who disappeared aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, these unanswered questions are more than just technical puzzles. They represent years of uncertainty, grief, and the hope that one day the truth will finally be discovered. Until the aircraft itself is found, The most important pieces of the puzzle remain hidden somewhere beneath the dark waters of the Indian Ocean. Part 8. Open Ending. More than a decade has passed since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared during what should have been a routine journey from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. In that time, investigators have studied radar records, analyzed satellite signals, searched vast regions of ocean, and examined every possible clue they could find. And yet, the truth still remains hidden. Some fragments of the aircraft have been discovered on distant shores across the Indian Ocean. These pieces confirm that the aircraft likely ended its journey somewhere in those remote waters. But the main wreckage, the silent witness to the aircraft's final moments, has never been found. Somewhere beneath those thousands of meters of dark ocean, the answers may still be waiting. Inside that wreckage could be the flight recorders, the devices designed to capture the last conversation and technical data from the cockpit. Those recordings might reveal whether the aircraft was diverted intentionally, whether a catastrophic emergency occurred, or whether something entirely unexpected unfolded that night. Until those devices are recovered, the final moments of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remain a mystery. Was the aircraft deliberately taken off course? Did the pilots struggle with an emergency that left them unable to communicate? Could a technical failure have silently disabled the crew while the aircraft continued to flying into the darkness? Or is there an explanation that investigators have not yet considered? For the families of the 239 passengers and crew members, the mystery is not just a story, it is a painful chapter that has never truly ended. Each unanswered question leaves space for doubt, speculation, and hope that one day the truth will finally be revealed. History has shown that even the deepest mystery can eventually be solved. Sometimes it takes decades before new technology, new discoveries, or a single overlooked clue reveals what really happened. Perhaps one day, a deep-sea exploration mission will locate the wreckage. Perhaps the flight recorders will finally tell the story of that night. Until then, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains one of the most haunting mysteries of our time. And now the question is left to you. When you look at the evidence, what do you believe really happened?